The morning Idris Whitford caught someone clearing his path. He had already spent 3 weeks wondering if he was losing his mind, or if some woodland spirit had taken pity on him. He lived alone in a weathered cabin at the edge of the Frostmark Woods, where the human settlements gave way to wild territory that no one claimed anymore. The war had ended 5 years ago, but the scars remained in the empty farms and abandoned homesteads that dotted the landscape like broken teeth. Idris had come here to escape those memories, to find peace in the solitude and the unforgiving beauty of the northern frontier. He had been a soldier once, and the things he had done still woke him in the night with his heart hammering against his ribs. Winter here was brutal. Snow fell in thick curtains that blotted out the sky, and the cold bit deep enough to make a man's bones ache. Every morning, Idris would wake before dawn to begin the arduous task of clearing the path from his cabin door to the small barn where he kept his goats and chickens. It was necessary work, tedious and exhausting, but it had to be done or he would be trapped, unable to tend his animals or reach the woodpile. Except for the past 3 weeks, he had not needed to shovel once. At first, he thought perhaps the wind had blown the snow away, creating some strange pattern of drifts that left his path clear. But that made no sense. The path was too deliberately cleared, too perfectly straight, and there were always neat piles of snow on either side as if someone had methodically shoveled from one end to the other. The rest of his small homestead was buried under fresh powder, but the path remained immaculate. Idris was not a superstitious man by nature, but living alone in the wilderness had a way of making even the most rational mind consider possibilities it would have dismissed in daylight and company. He began to wonder if perhaps some benevolent forest spirit was watching over him, or if the ghost of a previous homesteader still tended to old duties. He left offerings of bread and honey on his doorstep, feeling foolish but unwilling to risk offending whatever force had taken an interest in his welfare. The offerings were always gone by morning, which only deepened the mystery. It was on a particularly cold morning in late winter that Idris decided he would stay awake and discover the truth. The wind howled outside his cabin walls, rattling the shutters and sending drafts through every crack in the timber. He wrapped himself in furs and positioned himself by the small window that looked out over the path, determined to keep vigil no matter how long it took. The hours crawled past. Midnight came and went. The fire in his hearth burned low, and Idris added more wood, moving quietly so as not to make any noise that might scare away his mysterious benefactor. His eyes grew heavy despite his determination, and he had to pinch himself to stay alert. It was perhaps 2 hours before dawn when he heard it. The soft scrape of metal against stone, the distinctive sound of a shovel working through snow. Idris pressed his face against the cold glass, his breath fogging the window. In the pale light of the half-moon, he could see a figure working near his door. Someone large and powerfully built, moving with efficient purpose as they cleared away the night's fresh snowfall. The figure worked with practiced ease, muscles moving beneath heavy clothing as they lifted and tossed shovelful after shovelful of snow to the side of the path. His heart began to pound. This was no spirit. This was a person, flesh and blood, who had been coming to his homestead every night for weeks to perform this kindness. Idris grabbed his heavy coat and boots, pulling them on as quickly and quietly as he could manage. His hands shook slightly, though whether from cold or nerves he could not say. He eased open his door, wincing as the hinges creaked softly, and stepped out into the frigid night air. The figure's back was to him, still focused on the work of shoveling. In the moonlight, Idris could see more details now. The person was tall, broader in the shoulders than most men he knew, wearing a patchwork cloak that looked like it had been assembled from various scraps of leather and fur. Their movements were strong and sure, and there was something graceful in the way they worked despite the heavy labor involved. "Hello," Idris called out, his voice sounding too loud in the stillness of the winter night. The figure froze. For a long moment neither of them moved. Then slowly the person turned to face him. Idris felt his breath catch in his throat. In the moonlight, he could see green skin, darker where shadows fell across prominent cheekbones and a strong jaw. Small tusks curved up from a lower lip, catching the silvery light. Pointed ears poked through dark hair that had been pulled back in a practical braid. Eyes that gleamed like amber in the darkness stared at him with an expression that was equal parts startled and wary. An orc woman. An orc woman had been shoveling his path every morning for 3 weeks. The shock of it rooted him in place for several heartbeats. Orcs were not common in these parts anymore. During the war, they had been enemies, their clans allied with the northern kingdoms against Idris's homeland. He had fought them, killed them, watched his friends die at their hands and dealt death in return. The war had ended with a bitter peace treaty that satisfied no one, and most orcs had retreated to their traditional territories in the mountains. Those few who remained near human settlements were viewed with suspicion and hostility at best. And yet here was one, standing in his yard with a shovel, looking at him like a deer caught in lantern light. "I did not mean to disturb you," she said, and her voice was deeper than a human woman's, rougher, but there was something musical in it nonetheless. "I will go." "Wait," Idris said quickly, finding his voice. "Please, I just want to understand. Why have you been doing this?" She hesitated, her grip tightening on the shovel handle. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her body was coiled and ready to run or fight depending on which proved necessary. "You needed help," she said simply, as if that explained everything. "But why me? Why here?" The orc woman looked away, and even in the dim light he could see something that might have been embarrassment or shame cross her features. "I camp in the woods nearby. I have been there since autumn. I watched you working every morning, clearing the snow alone. It seemed hard for you. I thought I could make it easier." Her words were halting, as if she was not accustomed to explaining herself or perhaps not accustomed to speaking the common tongue at length. Idris realized with a start that she had been watching him for months, observing his daily routines from some hidden camp in the forest. The thought should have unsettled him, but instead he found himself oddly touched. "That is very kind of you," he said carefully. "I have been grateful, even when I did not know who to thank." She met his eyes again, and he saw surprise flicker across her face. "You are not angry, not afraid. Should I be?" "I am orc," she said, and there was something bitter in the way she said it, as if the word itself was an accusation she had heard too many times before. "Humans do not like my kind. They drive us away or worse." Idris thought about his years in the army, about the propaganda that had painted all orcs as monsters and savages. He thought about the orc warriors he had faced in battle, fierce and terrifying. But he also thought about the friends he had lost, about the senselessness of it all, about coming home to find that the things he had done in the name of duty had hollowed him out inside. "The war is over," he said quietly, "and I am tired of being afraid." She studied him for a long moment, her amber eyes searching his face as if looking for deception. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because some of the tension left her shoulders. "I should still go," she said. "I have been discovered. I will not trouble you again." "You have been no trouble," Idris said, and realized as he spoke that he meant it. "In fact, you have been the opposite of trouble. You have been help when I needed it and kindness from an unexpected source. I would like to thank you properly. Will you come inside? I have hot tea and bread." The orc woman stared at him as if he had just suggested something completely incomprehensible. "You want me to come inside your home, if you are willing. It is too cold to stand out here talking, and you have been working hard." He paused, then added, "My name is Idris Whitford." She was quiet for so long that he thought she might refuse. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I am called Grusha," she said, "and I will accept your tea, Idris Whitford." He led her inside, very aware of her presence behind him as they crossed the threshold. His cabin was small and spare, furnished with only the necessities. A bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, shelves for his meager supplies, and the stone hearth that dominated one wall. It was not much, but it was warm and dry, and he kept it as clean as military habits had taught him. Grusha stood just inside the door, looking around with curious eyes. She was even taller than he had realized, her head nearly brushing the low ceiling beams. In the firelight, her skin was a deeper green, and he could see the fine features of her face more clearly. She was not beautiful by human standards, but there was something compelling about her nonetheless, a strength and presence that demanded attention. He busied himself with the tea, adding more wood to the fire and filling a kettle with water from his supply bucket. The bread from yesterday was still good, and he set it out on the table along with a pot of honey and some dried berries. His hands moved through the familiar motions while his mind raced with questions he was not sure how to ask. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs. Grusha approached the table cautiously, as if expecting a trap. She sat down slowly, her movements careful and controlled. The chair creaked under her weight, and Idris made a mental note that she was probably quite a bit heavier than she looked, all of its solid muscle built through hard living. "How long have you been camping in the woods?" he asked as he waited for the water to boil. "Since the first frost," she replied. "Before that, I traveled south from the mountains looking for work or a place that might accept me. I found neither. No one would hire you." She made a sound that might have been a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Would you hire an orc to work your farm? Would you let one into your shop or business? Humans see me and remember the war. They see enemy, monster, danger. Sometimes they just see something to drive away. Sometimes they see something worse." The pain in her voice was raw and real, and Idris felt a pang of sympathy. He had seen how veterans were treated in the towns, how some people crossed the street to avoid them or looked at them with fear and disgust. He could only imagine how much worse it was for an orc trying to make a life in human lands. "I am sorry," he said. "That must be very difficult." Grusha looked at him with those unsettling amber eyes. "Why do you care?" "Because I know what it is like to be seen as something you are not sure you are anymore," he said quietly. "I was a soldier in the war. I did things I am not proud of, things that haunt me. When I came back, people treated me like a hero, but I did not feel like one. I felt like something broken that did not fit anywhere. That is why I came out here to the edge of everything, to find some kind of peace." The kettle began to whistle, and he poured the hot water over the tea leaves he had placed in 2 wooden cups. The steam rose in fragrant curls, carrying the scent of mint and herbs he had gathered the previous summer. He brought the cups to the table and sat down across from Grusha, sliding one toward her. She wrapped her large hands around the cup, and he noticed that her fingers were rough and calloused, the hands of someone who worked hard for survival. She inhaled the steam and closed her eyes for a moment, a gesture of simple pleasure that made her seem suddenly less intimidating and more human despite her very obvious differences. "This is good," she said after taking a sip. "I have not had hot tea in a long time." "Help yourself to the bread and honey," Idris said. "It is not much, but it is yours if you want it." Grusha tore off a piece of bread and dipped it in the honey, chewing slowly. For a while they sat in companionable silence, drinking tea and eating bread while the fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside it was warm and peaceful. "Why did you take the bread I left on the doorstep?" Idris asked eventually. "I thought perhaps it was an animal, but it must have been you." A faint green flush colored her cheeks, and he realized with fascination that she was blushing. "I should not have," she admitted. "But I was hungry, and you left it out where the snow would ruin it anyway. I told myself you meant it for whatever cleared your path, so taking it was not theft." "You were right," Idris said with a small smile. "I did mean it for whatever cleared my path. I just did not know I was feeding a person rather than a spirit. You thought a spirit was shoveling your path." "It seemed as reasonable as any other explanation," he said, and was surprised to hear her laugh. It was a real laugh this time, rich and warm, and it transformed her face completely. She looked younger when she laughed, less guarded, and he found himself wanting to hear that sound again. They talked for over an hour, long after the tea was gone and the bread eaten. Grusha told him about growing up in an orc clan in the northern mountains, about how her people had been recruited by the kingdom to fight in the war with promises of land and recognition. Those promises had evaporated when the war ended badly for the north. The orcs were left with nothing, blamed for the defeat, and driven away when they tried to claim what they had been promised. "My clan returned to the old territories," Grusha said, "but I could not go back. I had seen too much, learned too much about the world beyond the mountains. I wanted to find a different way, a life that was my own. My father said I was a fool. He said humans would never accept me, that I would die alone and unmourned. Perhaps he was right." "You are not dead yet," Idris pointed out, "and you are not alone in this moment." She looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "You are strange, Idris Whitford. You are not like other humans I have met." "I am not sure if that is a compliment or an insult," he said with a wry smile. "It is an observation," she replied, "but I think I mean it kindly." Eventually, the conversation wound down and Grusha rose to leave. Dawn was not far off, and Idris realized with a start that they had talked through most of the remaining night hours. He walked her to the door, suddenly reluctant to see her go. "Will you come back?" he asked, the words leaving his mouth before he could think better of them. Grusha paused in the doorway, her hand on the frame. "Why would you want me to?" "Because I enjoyed your company," he said honestly. "And because I think you could use a friend. I know I could." She was silent for a long moment, and he watched conflicting emotions play across her face. Finally, she nodded once. "I will come back, but I will come in daylight if that is acceptable. I am tired of hiding in shadows." "Daylight would be fine," Idris said, feeling something warm bloom in his chest. "Come tomorrow if you like. I will make stew." "I will bring firewood," she countered. "Your supply is running low." He could not argue with that, so he simply nodded his agreement. Grusha stepped out into the pre-dawn cold, and he watched as she retrieved her shovel and disappeared into the tree line with the kind of silent grace that spoke of years living in the wild. The path, he noticed, was completely clear of snow. Idris went back inside and sat down by the fire, his mind too active to consider sleep. Something had shifted in the course of this strange night, something he did not fully understand yet. He had been living in isolation for nearly a year, speaking to no one except the occasional trader who passed through in warmer months. The loneliness had become so much a part of his existence that he had stopped noticing it, like a low ache that fades into the background. Now, suddenly, he was aware of just how hungry he had been for connection, for someone to talk to who might understand what it was like to carry the weight of a past that did not fit comfortably into the present. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Idris threw himself into his chores with unusual energy, feeding the animals and mucking out the barn, checking his traps in the woods, and finding a rabbit that would make good stew. He skinned and prepared the meat, adding it to a pot with onions and carrots and turnips from his winter stores, along with herbs and melted snow for liquid. The stew bubbled over the fire, filling the cabin with rich, savory smells. He found himself looking out the window repeatedly, watching for any sign of movement at the tree line. It was ridiculous, he told himself. She was just a person, an orc woman who had shown him kindness and with whom he had shared an interesting conversation. There was no reason for him to feel this anticipation, this nervous energy that made it hard to sit still. But when the knock finally came at his door in the early afternoon, his heart leaped in his chest. Grusha stood on his threshold with an enormous bundle of firewood balanced on one shoulder. She had cleaned up since the night before, her dark hair freshly braided and her clothing, while still patched and worn, at least brushed free of forest debris. She looked almost nervous, which he found oddly endearing. "I brought wood, as promised," she said. "So I see," Idris replied, stepping aside. "Please come in. You can stack it by the hearth." She did so, moving with that same efficient grace he had noticed before. The pile of wood she brought was enough to last him a week or more, all good dry pieces that would burn hot and clean. She must have been gathering it for days, carefully selecting the best pieces. "The stew will be ready soon," he said. "I hope you are hungry." "I am always hungry," she admitted with a small smile. "Living in the woods, one never quite eats enough." They fell into conversation easily, picking up where they had left off the night before. Grusha told him about her attempts to find work in various human settlements, about the doors slammed in her face, and the stones thrown when she was too slow to leave. Idris shared his own struggles with coming home from the war, about the nightmares that still plagued him, and the way he sometimes flinched at sudden noises. When the stew was ready, they ate together at the small table, and Idris was gratified to see Grusha eat 3 full bowls. She closed her eyes with each bite, savoring the warmth and flavor in a way that suggested she had been subsisting on cold, inadequate meals for far too long. "This is very good," she said. "I had forgotten what it was like to eat hot food prepared with care." "You are welcome to it any time," Idris said. "I have more than enough for one person, and I am happy to share." She looked at him with those penetrating amber eyes. "Why are you doing this? Why are you being kind to me?" It was the same question she had asked before, and Idris took a moment to consider his answer. "Because you were kind to me first," he said finally. "Because you saw someone struggling and you helped without asking for anything in return. That is rare in this world, and I think it deserves to be honored. And because I think we might both benefit from having someone to talk to who understands what it is like to feel out of place in the world." Grusha was quiet for a long time, staring down at her empty bowl. When she looked up again, there was a shine in her eyes that might have been tears. "No one has ever said something like that to me before," she said softly. "You are the first human who has looked at me and seen a person." "Then other humans are fools," Idris said simply. This became their new pattern. Grusha would come by during daylight hours every few days, always bringing something useful. Firewood, herbs she had foraged, a brace of rabbits from her snares. Idris would feed her, and they would talk, sharing stories and slowly building something that resembled friendship. He learned that she was 23 years old, which was young for an orc, but already considered an adult by her people's standards. She had a wry sense of humor that caught him off guard and made him laugh more than he had in years. She was intelligent and observant, with a deep knowledge of the forest and its ways that came from living in harmony with the wild rather than trying to dominate it. She learned that he was 31, that he had lost his parents to sickness when he was young and had joined the army because it was the only option he could see for making a life. He had been a good soldier, disciplined and skilled, but the violence had worn away at something essential inside him. He had left the military as soon as his service was complete and come north to find solitude and healing. Winter began to loosen its grip as the weeks passed. The snow became less frequent, and the days grew incrementally longer. Idris found himself looking forward to Grush's visits with an intensity that should have alarmed him, but somehow did not. She was the bright spot in his days, the thing that made the long hours of routine labor feel purposeful rather than merely endless. He told himself it was just friendship, just gratitude for her help and companionship. He tried not to notice the way his heart beat faster when he saw her approaching through the trees, or the way his eyes tracked her movements when she was in his cabin. He tried not to think about how much he enjoyed her laugh, or the way she listened to him with complete attention when he spoke, as if his words actually mattered. It was a losing battle, and on some level he knew it. The moment when everything changed came on a clear, cold day in early spring. The snow was melting in earnest now, leaving the ground muddy and treacherous. Idris was working on repairing the roof of his barn, which had sustained damage during a particularly fierce storm the week before. He was balanced on a ladder, trying to fit a new piece of thatch into place, when the ladder's foot slipped in the mud. He felt himself falling, had just enough time to realize this was going to hurt badly, and then strong arms caught him before he could hit the ground. Grusha had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, moving with the kind of speed that suggested she had been nearby when she heard the commotion. She held him easily despite the awkward angle of his fall, her strength making him feel almost weightless. For a moment they were frozen in place, her arms around him and his hands clutching at her shoulders for stability. He looked up into her face, so close to his own, and saw something in her amber eyes that took his breath away. It was not just concern or relief that he was unhurt. It was something deeper, more vulnerable, a tenderness that she immediately tried to hide when she realized he had seen it. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice rougher than usual. "No," he managed. "Thanks to you, that could have been very bad." She set him on his feet carefully, then stepped back as if the contact had burned her. "You should be more careful," she said. "The mud is treacherous." "I will be," he promised, but he was barely paying attention to his own words. Something had shifted between them in that brief moment of contact, a recognition of feelings that had been building beneath the surface of their friendship. He could see it in the way she would not quite meet his eyes, in the tension of her shoulders, in the careful distance she maintained as they stood in his muddy yard. "I should go," Grusha said abruptly. "I have things I need to do in my camp." "Wait," Idris said, reaching out before he could stop himself. His hand caught hers and she froze. Her hand was warm and rough, larger than his own, and holding it felt both strange and completely natural. "Please do not go, not like this." "Like what?" she asked, but there was something almost desperate in the question. "Like you are running away from something," he said quietly. "Like you are afraid." She finally met his eyes, and what he saw there made his chest ache. "I am afraid," she admitted. "I am afraid because I have been feeling things I should not feel. You have been kind to me, given me friendship when I had none, and I have repaid that by wanting more than I have any right to want." His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. "What if you are not the only one feeling that way?" Grusha stared at him as if he had just spoken in a language she did not understand. "That is impossible," she said, but her voice was unsteady. "You are human. I am orc. Even if you think you feel something now, you would come to regret it. Everyone would condemn you. Your own people would turn against you for being with a monster. "You are not a monster," Idris said fiercely, "and I do not care what other people think. I stopped caring about that when I came here to live alone in the wilderness. All I care about is what I know to be true, and I know that I look forward to your visits more than anything else in my life. I know that I think about you when you are not here. I know that holding you just now felt right in a way that nothing else has in years." She shook her head, but she had not pulled her hand away from his. "You do not know what you are saying. You do not know what it would mean to choose this, to choose me." "Then tell me," he said. "Help me understand." Grusha took a shaky breath. "If we were together, if we tried to make something between us, we would have to hide it or face constant persecution. Other humans would hate you for it, call you traitor and monster lover and worse. And my own people, if they knew, would declare me dead to the clan. An orc who takes a human mate is considered to have betrayed everything our kind stands for. We would have no place in either world." "We would have each other," Idris said. "And this place, this cabin. It is not much, but it could be enough." "You cannot mean that," she whispered. "I have never meant anything more in my life," he said, and realized as he spoke that it was true. The loneliness he had been carrying for so long had begun to lift the moment Grusha entered his life, and the thought of going back to that empty existence was unbearable. Whatever this was between them, whatever it might become, he wanted it with a ferocity that surprised him. Grusha looked at him for a long moment, and he watched emotions flicker across her face too quickly to name. Then, slowly, she squeezed his hand. "I want that too," she said, her voice barely audible. "More than I can say, but I am afraid of what it will cost you." "Let me worry about that," Idris said. "I am a grown man and I can make my own choices. I choose this. I choose you if you will have me." She made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. And then suddenly, she was pulling him into an embrace that lifted him off his feet. He wrapped his arms around her broad shoulders and held on, feeling the solid strength of her and the rapid beating of her heart against his chest. She buried her face against his neck, and he felt the warmth of her breath on his skin. "I will have you," she said into his shoulder, "if you are truly sure." "I am sure," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the muddy yard while the spring sun shone down and the world seemed full of possibility. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling despite the tears on Grusha's cheeks. "Come inside," Idris said. "Let us talk about what happens next." They went into the cabin together, and this time when Grusha sat at his table, it felt different. The careful distance that had always existed between them was gone, replaced by something warmer and more intimate. Idris made tea and they sat close together, their knees touching under the table. "We should be practical," Grusha said, though she was smiling as she said it. "If we are going to do this, we need to think about how it will work." "You could move into the cabin," Idris suggested. "There is room enough for two, and it would be better than living in a camp in the woods." She looked around the small space, her eyes lingering on various details. "I would like that," she admitted, "but I would need to bring my things and I would want to contribute. I cannot just live off your charity." "It would not be charity," Idris said. "It would be partnership. We would share the work and the rewards. Your skills and knowledge would make this homestead stronger." They spent the rest of the afternoon planning. Grusha's experience living off the land meant she knew where to find medicinal herbs and wild vegetables that Idris had never even noticed. She was an excellent hunter and trapper, better than he was, and her strength would make many of the heavy tasks around the homestead much easier. In turn, Idris had resources she lacked: shelter, stored food, tools, and a legitimate claim to the land that would protect them from being driven off. "We could expand the garden in the spring," Grusha said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. There is good soil beyond the barn that is not being used, and I know where there is a berry patch in the forest that produces heavily in summer. We could preserve enough to trade with the occasional travelers who pass through. We could build a larger chicken coop, Idris added. With more eggs, we could afford to sell some and use the coin to buy things we cannot make ourselves. They talked until the sun began to set, making plans and dreaming of a future that had seemed impossible just hours before. When Grusha finally left to retrieve her belongings from her camp, Idris watched her go with a feeling of contentment he had not experienced in years. She returned before full dark, carrying a large pack that contained everything she owned in the world. It was not much: spare clothing, a bedroll, some cooking utensils, her weapons for hunting, and a few personal items wrapped carefully in oiled cloth. Idris helped her bring it all inside, and they began the process of reorganizing the cabin to accommodate 2 people instead of 1. That first night was awkward in the way that all new arrangements are. They had to negotiate sleeping arrangements with the care of people who were not yet sure of all the boundaries. Idris offered her the bed and said he would sleep on the floor, but Grusha refused to take it. "We are partners now," she said firmly. "We will share what we have, including the sleeping space. The bed is large enough for 2 if we are careful." So they lay down together on opposite sides of the bed, both of them stiff and hyper-aware of the other's presence. But sometime in the night, when the fire had burned down to embers and the cabin was cold, they gravitated toward each other's warmth. Idris woke in the morning to find himself curled against Grusha's back, his arm draped over her waist, and her hand resting on his where it lay against her stomach. She was already awake, he realized, but she had not moved away. When he stirred, she squeezed his hand gently. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft. "Good morning," he replied, and made no move to pull away. They lay like that for a while longer, comfortable in the shared warmth, before the necessities of the day forced them to rise and begin their chores. Life fell into a new rhythm. They worked together during the day, sharing tasks and discovering how to coordinate their efforts. Grusha's strength meant she could handle jobs that would have taken Idris hours, but she also had a tendency to rush ahead without planning, which sometimes created more problems than it solved. Idris was better at thinking things through, at seeing potential issues before they arose, but he sometimes got too caught up in the details and lost sight of the larger goal. Together, they balanced each other out. They learned each other's habits and quirks, adapting and adjusting as they went. Grusha sang while she worked, old orc songs in a language Idris did not understand, and the music made even tedious tasks more pleasant. Idris read aloud in the evenings from his small collection of books, and Grusha would listen with rapt attention, asking questions about words and concepts that were unfamiliar to her. They grew comfortable with physical affection, though neither of them pushed for more than the other seemed ready to give. They held hands while walking through the woods, sat close together by the fire, and slept curled around each other every night. It was sweet and tender, and Idris found himself falling deeper in love with each passing day. The moment when their relationship became something more happened almost a month after Grusha moved in. They had spent the day working on expanding the garden, breaking up the hard soil and mixing in compost Idris had been building for over a year. It was back-breaking work, and by the time they finished at sunset, both of them were exhausted and filthy. They drew water from the well and took turns washing in the basin inside the cabin, trying to scrub away the worst of the dirt. Grusha went first, stripping off her shirt unself-consciously and washing her face and arms. Idris tried not to stare, but it was impossible not to notice the play of muscles under her green skin. the scars that marked her body from various hardships, the strange and compelling beauty of her form. When it was his turn, he was acutely aware of her eyes on him as he washed. He was not ashamed of his body, but he was conscious of his own scars, the marks left by war and hard living. When he turned around, he found Grusha watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "You are beautiful," she said, and there was wonder in her voice. He gave a surprised laugh. "I think that is the first time anyone has ever called me that." "Then other people are blind," she said, moving closer. "You are beautiful to me." She reached out and traced one of the scars on his shoulder, her touch feather light. He shivered, and not from cold. Her hand moved to his face, cupping his cheek with surprising gentleness for someone so strong. "May I kiss you?" she asked, her voice low. "Please," he breathed. She leaned down, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was careful and sweet and full of barely restrained desire. Her tusks pressed against his lips in an unfamiliar sensation that quickly became pleasant. He reached up and tangled his fingers in her hair, pulling her closer, and the kiss deepened. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," Grusha admitted. "So have I," Idris said. "Why did we wait so long?" "Because we are both fools," she said with a laugh, and then she was kissing him again. They made their way to the bed, hands exploring and learning the geography of each other's bodies. Grusha was patient and careful, always checking to make sure Idris was comfortable with each new touch. He found himself fascinated by the differences between them, the way her skin felt slightly thicker than his, the heat that radiated from her, the strength in her hands that she kept carefully controlled. They made love slowly, taking time to learn what brought pleasure and what did not. There were moments of awkwardness when their different anatomies required adjustment, but there was also laughter and tenderness and a deep sense of rightness. Afterward, they lay tangled together, skin to skin, and Idris felt a peace settle over him that he had been seeking for years. "I love you," he said into the darkness, the words slipping out before he could think about them. Grusha went very still beside him. "Do you mean that?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he said. "I know it is fast and maybe it is foolish, but I love you. You do not have to say it back if you are not ready. I just needed you to know." She pulled him closer, her arms wrapping around him like a shield against the world. "I love you too," she whispered fiercely. "I have loved you since you invited me in from the cold and treated me like a person instead of a monster. I was just too afraid to let myself believe it could be real." They fell asleep like that, holding each other close, and when Idris woke in the morning he felt like he had finally found the home he had been searching for. The spring turned to summer, and their homestead flourished. The expanded garden produced more vegetables than they knew what to do with, and Grusha's berry patch yielded buckets full of sweet fruit that they preserved in honey and sealed in clay jars. The chickens multiplied, and Idris built a larger coop with Grusha's help. They traded eggs and preserved berries with the occasional trader who passed through, carefully avoiding mention of Grusha or making sure she stayed out of sight when necessary. It was not a perfect solution, but it worked well enough. Most of the time, they were left alone in their remote homestead, able to live as they wished without interference. They built a life together that was simple and good, full of hard work and simple pleasures, but they could not remain isolated forever. In late summer, a group of hunters passed through on their way to the deeper woods. Idris went out to greet them, as was customary, offering to sell them eggs and vegetables for their journey. They were rough men, scarred and hard-eyed, but they seemed friendly enough. Until one of them spotted Grusha through the cabin window. "Is that an orc?" the man demanded, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. Idris felt his blood run cold, but he kept his voice steady. "That is my wife," he said calmly. "She is no threat to anyone. Your wife." The hunter spat on the ground. "You are lying with a monster. That is disgusting, against nature." "She is not a monster," Idris said, and there was steel in his voice now. "And who I choose to love is none of your concern. Take your business elsewhere if you cannot be civil." The hunters exchanged glances, and Idris saw the moment when they decided to make trouble. One of them started toward the cabin, but before Idris could move, Grusha emerged from the door. She had armed herself with the woodcutting axe, and she stood on the threshold with the weapon held in a way that made it clear she knew how to use it. "You are on our land," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. "You were offered hospitality and chose to respond with insults. Leave now, while you still can." The hunters hesitated. There were 3 of them, but Grusha was imposing when she wanted to be, and the axe in her hands looked very sharp. Idris moved to stand beside her, his own hand resting on the knife at his belt. "This is not over," one of the hunters snarled. "People need to know there is a monster living out here. We will spread the word." "You do that," Idris said coldly. "And make sure to tell them that anyone who comes looking for trouble will find it." The hunters left, but their parting looks promised that this was indeed not over. After they disappeared down the trail, Idris and Grusha went back inside, both of them shaken. "They will tell others," Grusha said, setting the axe aside with hands that trembled slightly. "More will come, and they may bring violence with them." "Then we will deal with it," Idris said firmly. "We have every right to be here to live as we choose. I will not let anyone drive us away." But the encounter had reminded them both of how precarious their situation was. They were isolated and vulnerable, and while they could defend themselves against a small group, a larger mob would overwhelm them. "Maybe we should leave," Grusha said quietly. "Go deeper into the wilderness, find a place where no one will bother us." Idris considered this, looking around the cabin they had worked so hard to improve, thinking about the garden and the animals and all the effort they had put into building a life here. "Or maybe we should stay and fight for what is ours," he said. "Running will not solve the problem. There will always be people who hate us for being together. At some point we have to stand our ground." Grusha looked at him with those amber eyes that saw too much. "You would risk your life to stay here, to be with me." "I would risk anything to be with you," he said simply. "You are worth it." "We are worth it." She pulled him into a fierce embrace. "Then we will stand together," she said. "Whatever comes." What came was, at first, nothing. Days passed into weeks with no sign of trouble. Idris and Grusha remained vigilant, but their lives continued much as before. They harvested their crops, tended their animals, and prepared for the coming autumn. Then, on a cool evening in early fall, they saw lights moving through the forest toward their homestead. Torches, Idris realized with a sinking feeling in his stomach. At least a dozen of them, carried by people moving with purpose through the trees. Behind him, Grusha drew in a sharp breath. "Get inside," Idris said. "Bar the door." "I will not hide while you face them alone," Grusha said flatly. "Then we face them together," Idris replied and took her hand. The mob emerged from the trees and formed a rough semicircle around the cabin. Idris recognized some of them from nearby settlements he had visited in the past year. Farmers, trappers, a blacksmith from the closest village. Most of them were armed with whatever they had at hand: farming tools, hunting weapons, clubs. Their faces were set and angry, illuminated by the flickering torchlight. "Idris Whitford," one of them called out. It was the blacksmith, a burly man named Jorn. "We heard you are harboring an orc. We have come to remove it from these lands." "She is not in it," Idris said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Her name is Grusha, and she is my wife. She has as much right to be here as anyone." No orc has rights in human lands, another voice shouted. They are monsters, enemies. You fought in the war, Whitford. You should know that better than anyone. The war is over, Idris said. And I learned something from it. I learned that the people we are told to hate are not so different from us. They love, they suffer, they hope for better lives just like we do. Grusha has done nothing to any of you. She works hard, keeps to herself, and bothers no one. What right do you have to come to my home with weapons and threats? She is an orc, Jorn said, as if that explained everything. They cannot be trusted. How long before she turns on you? Or brings more of her kind down on all of us? I have no clan anymore, Grusha said, speaking for the first time. I chose to leave my people and live in peace. I want no war, no violence. I only want to make a life with the man I love. Is that so wrong? Her words seemed to give some of the mob pause. Idris saw uncertainty flicker across several faces, but others only looked angrier. It is against nature, someone shouted. Humans and orcs were not meant to mix. It is wrong, perverted. Who are you to say what is natural? Idris demanded. Who gave you the right to judge how others live their lives? We harm no one. We keep to ourselves. The only people bringing violence and hatred here are you. We did not come here to debate, Jorn said, though he sounded less certain now. The orc has to go. If you will not send her away, we will remove her by force. Idris felt Grusha tense beside him, readying for a fight. He squeezed her hand and took a step forward. If you want to remove her, you will have to go through me first, he said clearly. I fought in the war. I know how to kill, and I will do it to protect my wife if I must. Is this really worth dying over, worth killing over? We have done nothing to you. The mob shifted uneasily. Idris was betting that most of them had not come here truly expecting violence, that they had thought their numbers and righteous anger would be enough to intimidate him into compliance. Now they were faced with the reality that this could turn bloody, that people might die, and that was a different calculation entirely. The law is on our side, someone said, but without much conviction. What law? Idris challenged. Show me the law that says two people who love each other cannot live together in peace. There is no such law. The war is over. The treaties were signed. What you are doing here is mob rule, nothing more. You should be ashamed. There was a long, tense silence. The mob remained arrayed before them, but Idris could see the momentum had shifted. People were looking at each other uncertainly, no longer quite sure what they were doing here. Finally, an older woman stepped forward from the crowd. Idris recognized her as someone who ran a small inn in the nearest village. I do not like this, she said clearly. I do not like orcs, and I do not understand why anyone would choose to be with one. But I like mob violence even less. We are not murderers. We are supposed to be better than the things we fought against in the war. We cannot just let this stand, Jorn protested. If we allow this, what is next? What is next is that we go home and tend to our own business, the woman said firmly. Whitford is right. They have harmed no one. We have no right to come here with weapons and threats. She looked directly at Idris and Grusha. I will not be your friend, she said bluntly. I will not pretend to understand or approve of what you are doing, but I will not be part of this mob either. She turned and walked back toward the forest. After a moment, several others followed her. The mob began to fracture, people peeling away in ones and twos, until only a handful of the most hardline remained. This is not over, Jorn said, but even he seemed deflated now. People will remember. You will not be welcome in the settlements. I never expected to be, Idris said. Now get off my land. The last of the mob dispersed, taking their torches with them and leaving the night suddenly dark and quiet. Idris and Grusha stood together in the yard until the last light disappeared among the trees, and only then did they allow themselves to relax. Grusha pulled him into a tight embrace, and he felt her shaking. "That was terrifying," she said into his shoulder. "Yes," he agreed, "but we survived it. We stood together and we survived." "You think they will come back?" "I do not know," Idris said honestly. "Maybe, but I think tonight we showed them that we are not easy targets, that we will fight if we have to. That may be enough to make them think twice." They went inside and barred the door, something they rarely did, and sat together by the fire for a long time without speaking. The encounter had shaken them both, forcing them to confront the reality of the hostility they faced from the outside world. "Are you sorry?" Grusha asked eventually. "Sorry that you chose this, chose me?" Idris turned to her, taking her face in his hands. "Never," he said fiercely. "I am angry that we have to deal with such hatred and ignorance, but I am not sorry for loving you. I will never be sorry for that." She kissed him, deep and desperate, and they held each other through the night, finding comfort and strength in their connection. The next few months were difficult. True to Jorn's word, they were no longer welcome in the nearby settlements. When Idris tried to trade for supplies, people refused to do business with him. Some were actively hostile, others simply turned away without a word. They were not violently driven out, but they were frozen out, excluded from the community. It forced them to become even more self-sufficient. They relied on what they could grow, hunt, and forage, and they learned to make do without the goods they could no longer purchase. It was hard, but they managed. Their love sustained them through the lean times, giving them the strength to face each new challenge. Winter came again, and with it a heavy snow that isolated them completely from the outside world. But unlike the previous winter when Idris had been alone, this year he had Grusha beside him. They stayed warm by the fire, rationing their supplies carefully, and passed the long dark evenings in conversation and companionship. It was during one of these evenings that Grusha made an announcement that changed everything. "I think I am pregnant," she said quietly. Idris looked up from the pot he was stirring, his mind taking a moment to process her words. "You think you are pregnant?" he repeated. She nodded, her hand moving unconsciously to her stomach. "I was not sure at first, but now I am certain. I have all the signs. There is a child growing inside me." Joy and terror warred in Idris's chest. A child. They were going to have a child. The idea was wonderful and terrifying in equal measure. "How do you feel about it?" he asked carefully. "Scared," Grusha admitted. "Happy but scared." A half-orc, half-human child will face even more prejudice than we do. They will not be fully accepted by either side. And I do not know if we can survive out here with an infant. Babies are vulnerable. They need so much. Idris crossed to her and knelt down, placing his hand over hers on her stomach. "We will manage," he said firmly. "We have managed everything else so far. This child will be loved and wanted, and we will protect them with everything we have. They will grow up knowing that they came from love, not hate." Grusha looked at him with tears in her eyes. "You are a good man, Idris Whitford. Our child is fortunate to have you as a father." "And they are fortunate to have you as a mother," he replied. "We will do this together, just like everything else." The pregnancy progressed through the winter and into the spring. Grusha bloomed with health, her body adapting to the changes with the resilience of orc physiology. Idris did his best to make things easier for her, taking on more of the heavy work and making sure she had plenty of food and rest. They prepared for the baby as best they could, setting aside soft cloth for swaddling, carving a small cradle from wood, gathering herbs that Grusha said would be needed for the birth. Idris found himself consumed with worry about all the things that could go wrong, but Grusha remained calm and confident. "Orc women have been giving birth for thousands of years," she reminded him when his anxiety became too obvious. I am strong and healthy. The baby will be fine. She went into labor on a warm afternoon in late spring, when the world was green and alive with new growth. Idris had never felt so helpless in his life as he watched her work through the contractions, breathing deeply and making low sounds of pain and effort. He fetched water and cloth, held her hand when she needed it, and tried not to let his fear show on his face. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the afternoon and into the night. There were moments when Idris was certain something was wrong, that they needed help they could not get, but Grusha never lost her composure. She worked with her body, trusting in its strength and endurance. Finally, just before dawn, their child entered the world with a lusty cry that filled the cabin. Idris cut the cord with shaking hands and helped Grusha clean the baby while she cradled them against her chest. "A boy," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "We have a son." Idris looked down at the tiny creature in her arms and felt his heart expand with a love so fierce it almost hurt. The baby was small and perfect, his skin a pale green that was lighter than his mother's but darker than human skin, with tiny pointed ears and the suggestion of small bumps on his lower jaw where tusks might eventually grow. His eyes, when they opened, were a striking blue-green. "He is beautiful," Idris breathed. "What should we call him?" They had discussed names during the pregnancy, but now that the baby was real and here, those conversations seemed inadequate. Grusha looked down at their son with tired eyes full of love. "In Orcish tradition, a child's name should reflect hope for their future," she said. "I think we should call him Kale. It means strong heart in my language." "Kale Whitford," Idris said, testing the name. "I like it. Strong heart. He will need that growing up in this world." "He will have it," Grusha said firmly. "He comes from two people who faced hatred and fear and chose love anyway. That strength will be in him." The first months with a newborn were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Kale was a healthy baby with strong lungs and a healthy appetite. Grusha nursed him with the ease of her Orc heritage, which could sustain children on mother's milk alone for longer than human babies. Idris learned to soothe the baby when he cried, to change his swaddling, to rock him to sleep in the small hours of the morning. They were isolated from the world, but in their isolation, they found a kind of peace. Their little family was complete unto itself, needing nothing from the outside world but what they could provide for each other. Idris had never been happier, despite the hardships and challenges. When Kale was 3 months old, they had an unexpected visitor. Idris saw the lone figure approaching from the forest and immediately went on alert. But as the person drew closer, he saw it was the older woman from the inn, the one who had spoken against the mob. She approached slowly, hands held out to show she meant no harm. "May I speak with you?" she called out. Idris glanced back at the cabin where Grusha was inside with Kale. He nodded slowly. "You can speak," he said, "but come no closer unless invited." The woman stopped at the edge of the yard. She looked older than he remembered, tired and worn. "My name is Martha Wright," she said. "I came to apologize." "For what?" Idris asked warily. "For being part of that mob, even if I did speak against violence in the end," she said. "For not doing more to stop it. For the way you have been treated since. It has been bothering me all winter. I could not stop thinking about it." "Why?" Idris asked. "What do you care what happens to us?" Martha sighed. "Because I lost my son in the war," she said quietly. "He was a good boy, kind and gentle. He did not want to fight, but he went because he believed it was his duty. He died in some nameless battle in the north, and his body was never recovered. I spent years hating Orcs for taking him from me. But this winter, I kept thinking about what you said. About how the war is over, and we all have to find a way to live with what happened. And I realized that my son would not have wanted me to hate. He was better than that. She looked at Idris with eyes full of old grief. I am not saying I understand what you and your wife have. I am not saying I approve, but I am saying that you are right. You have done no harm, and you deserve to be left in peace. I wanted you to know that at least one person in the settlement sees that. Idris felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. Thank you, he said quietly. That means more than you know, Martha nodded. I also came to bring you this. She pulled a bundle from her pack and set it on the ground. Some supplies, cloth, needles, and thread, a bit of sugar and salt. I heard through the gossip that your wife had a baby. Congratulations. Every child deserves a chance at life, no matter who their parents are. She turned to leave, but Idris called out, Wait. He made a decision in that moment, one he hoped he would not regret. Would you like to meet him? Our son, Martha turned back, surprise written across her face. You would let me. You showed us kindness when others did not, Idris said. That earns you the right to see what that kindness meant. He led her to the cabin and opened the door. Grusha was sitting by the fire with Kale cradled in her arms, and she looked up in alarm when she saw they had a visitor. But Idris gave her a reassuring nod, and she relaxed slightly. Grusha, this is Martha Wright, Idris said. She was one of the people who spoke against the mob. She has brought us gifts for the baby. Grusha studied Martha for a long moment, then stood and carried Kale over. This is our son, Kale, she said, her voice wary but not hostile. Martha looked down at the baby, and Idris saw tears spring to her eyes. He is beautiful, she whispered. So small and perfect. May I? She held out her arms, and after a moment's hesitation, Grusha placed Kale in them. Martha held the baby with the practiced ease of someone who had raised children of her own. She looked down at his small face with an expression of such tenderness that it made Idris's throat tight. Hello, little one, she murmured. You have no idea how much courage it took for your parents to bring you into this world. You are loved, do you understand? You are loved and wanted. She handed Kale back to Grusha, wiping at her eyes. Thank you for letting me hold him, she said. I have not held a baby since my son was small. I had forgotten how precious they are. After Martha left, Grusha looked at Idris with wonder in her eyes. Do you think that could happen more? She asked. That people might start to see us as something other than monsters and traitors. I do not know, Idris said honestly, but it is a start. One person changing their mind is a start. Martha proved to be true to her word. She came by occasionally over the following months, always bringing small gifts or supplies. She never stayed long, but her visits were a connection to the outside world that they had been lacking. Through her, they learned that attitudes in the settlements were slowly shifting. The mob mentality had faded, and while most people still disapproved of Idris and Grusha's relationship, the outright hostility had diminished. People have their own problems to worry about, Martha explained during one visit. The harvest was poor last year, and there is talk of new taxes from the regional governor. Your mixed marriage is yesterday's scandal. Life moves on. It was not acceptance, but it was a kind of peace. They would never be welcomed with open arms, but neither would they be driven out. It was enough. As Kale grew from an infant into a toddler, Idris and Grusha watched with wonder as he developed his own personality. He was a happy child, quick to laugh and curious about everything. He had his mother's strength and his father's thoughtfulness, and he seemed to fear nothing. He babbled in a mixture of common tongue and Orcish, learning words from both his parents. When he was old enough to understand, they began to teach him about his heritage, about both sides of his family and the worlds he came from. You are special, Grusha told him, holding him in her lap. You are the best of both humans and orcs. You carry the strength and honor of my people and the ingenuity and compassion of your father's people. Never let anyone tell you that you are less because you are different. You are more. Idris taught his son to tend the animals and the garden, to respect the land and the forest, to work hard and be honest. Grusha taught him to track and hunt, to understand the language of the wild, to be proud of his heritage. Together they raised him with love and care, determined that he would grow up knowing his worth. One day, when Kale was 3 years old, Martha arrived with news. "There is another family like yours," she said. "A human man and an orc woman with a child. They heard about you through travelers and came asking if they might settle nearby. They want to know if they would be welcome." Idris and Grusha looked at each other, both of them thinking the same thing. They were not alone. There were others who had made the same choice, who had decided that love was worth the cost. "Tell them to come," Idris said. "Tell them they are welcome. Tell them we will help them however we can." The family arrived a week later, tired and wary but hopeful. Their story was similar to Idris and Grusha's. They had met after the war, fallen in love despite the obstacles, and been driven out of their previous home by prejudice and fear. Their daughter was 2 years old, a beautiful little girl with her mother's green skin and her father's brown eyes. Together, the two families began to build something new. They helped each other with the heavy work of homesteading, shared resources and knowledge, and provided the support that came from knowing someone else understood what you were going through. Kale and the little girl, whose name was Lyra, became fast friends, playing together while their parents worked. More families came over the following years. News spread through the frontier that there was a place where human-orc couples could live without fear, where their children could grow up in peace. It was still isolated, still on the edge of civilized lands, but it was theirs. They built a small community of outcasts and dreamers, people who had chosen love over hate and were determined to make it work. They called it Crossroads, because it was where different paths met and became one. It was not a large settlement, perhaps 20 families at its peak, but it was vibrant and alive. The children grew up playing together without seeing differences in skin color or the presence or absence of tusks. They were just children, and that gave Idris hope for the future. Grusha became a leader in the community, her strength and practical wisdom making her a natural person for others to look to. Idris found himself serving as a mediator and organizer, using his ability to see all sides of an issue to help resolve disputes and plan for the community's needs. Together, they helped build something that might, in time, become a beacon of hope for others. On the 10th anniversary of the morning Idris had caught Grusha shoveling his path, they stood together looking out over Crossroads. Children played in the common area, their laughter ringing clear in the air. Smoke rose from chimneys, and people moved about their business with the easy confidence of those who felt safe in their homes. "You ever regret it?" Grusha asked, slipping her hand into his. "All of this?" Idris squeezed her hand and pulled her close. "Not for one moment," he said. "You gave me everything I needed and more than I ever expected. You gave me love, a family, a purpose. You gave me Kale and this community and a life worth living. How could I possibly regret any of that?" She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stood together in comfortable silence. Kale ran by with his friends, 11 years old now and full of energy, shouting something about a game they were playing. He waved at his parents as he passed, his smile bright and untroubled. "He is so happy," Grusha said softly. "That is all I ever wanted, for him to grow up happy and safe." "He is," Idris assured her, "and he will stay that way. We will make sure of it." More years passed. The community grew and prospered. Martha Wright became a regular visitor, and she was not alone. Other humans from the settlements began to come. curious about the strange community where humans and orcs lived together in peace. Some came with hostility, but many came with genuine curiosity, and those who stayed long enough to see how Crossroads functioned often left with changed perspectives. Trade relationships developed. The community produced goods that the settlements needed: herbs and furs and skilled crafts, and in return they were able to purchase things they could not make themselves. It was tentative and sometimes strained, but it was progress. Kale grew into a strong young man, tall and powerfully built like his mother, with his father's thoughtful nature and kind heart. He became something of a legend in the region, the first child born of both races who had grown up openly and without shame. Other children looked up to him, and he wore that responsibility with grace. When Kale was 17, he fell in love with a human girl from one of the settlements, a farmer's daughter named Sarah, who had come to Crossroads with her father to trade and stayed longer than she meant to. She saw past his mixed heritage to the person underneath, and he saw past her initial wariness to her generous heart. Idris and Grusha gave their blessing to the match, and when Kale and Sarah married in a ceremony that blended human and orcish traditions, it felt like a completion of something that had begun years ago when Idris first invited Grusha in from the cold. Love had conquered fear and prejudice, not just once, but again and again, spreading like ripples in a pond. The years continued to pass, bringing changes both joyful and sorrowful. Martha Wright passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 73, and the entire community of Crossroads mourned her as one of their own. She had been a bridge between worlds, and her loss was felt deeply, but there were joys too. Kale and Sarah had children of their own, making Idris and Grusha grandparents. The babies were more human in appearance than their father had been, but they carried orc heritage in their strength and constitution. They grew up in a Crossroads that was now firmly established, no longer a fragile experiment but a proven success. Idris and Grusha aged together, their hair going gray, their movements becoming slower but no less sure. They had built a life beyond anything Idris had imagined that first winter when he had lived alone in his cabin, wondering who was mysteriously clearing his path. They had built a family, a community, a legacy that would outlast them. On a quiet evening in their later years, they sat together on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over Crossroads. The cabin had been expanded over the years, adding rooms for children and guests, but the original heart of it remained the hearth where they had shared their first cup of tea, the table where they had made their plans, the bed where they had discovered love. "You remember that first morning?" Grusha asked, her voice still strong despite her years. "When you caught me shoveling, how could I forget?" Idris replied with a laugh. "I thought you were a forest spirit come to haunt me." "And I thought you would drive me away or worse," she said. "I was so afraid when you called out to me. But you invited me in instead. You offered me tea and kindness when I had known neither for so long." "It was the best decision I ever made," Idris said simply. They sat in silence for a while, hands clasped together, watching the familiar rhythms of their community. People passed by on the road calling out greetings. Children played in the distance. Smoke rose from cooking fires as families prepared their evening meals. "We did well," Grusha said eventually. "Did we not?" "We did very well," Idris agreed. "Better than either of us had any right to hope for. We found each other in the darkness and we built something bright." She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her close. They had weathered so much together: prejudice and fear, isolation and hardship, the challenges of raising a family and building a community. Through it all, their love had remained constant, the foundation on which everything else was built. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Idris found himself thinking about that long-ago winter morning, about the mysterious cleared path and the decision to stay awake and discover its source. Such a small thing, really, catching someone shoveling snow. But that small moment had changed everything. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" Grusha asked. "For clearing my path," he said. "For seeing me struggling and deciding to help. For taking a risk on a stranger. For everything that came after." She turned her head to look at him, her amber eyes still bright despite the years. "Thank you for catching me," she replied. "For not driving me away. For giving me a home when I had none. For loving me when everyone said it was impossible." They kissed, soft and sweet. The kiss of two people who had walked a long road together and were still happy to be walking it. The night grew darker, and the stars grew brighter, but they remained on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, grateful beyond measure for the life they had built from a chance encounter on a snowy morning long ago. Their story became the foundation myth of Crossroads, told and retold to children and newcomers alike. The tale of the lonely veteran and the outcast orc woman who had found each other and built something beautiful from their shared isolation became a symbol of hope and possibility. It proved that bridges could be built between divided peoples, that love could triumph over hate, and that the choices of two brave individuals could change the world. And in the end, that was all they had ever wanted: to live their lives with dignity and love, and perhaps to make the world a little bit better than they had found it. By that measure, their lives had been an unqualified success. When Idris and Grusha eventually passed, many years later and within months of each other, Crossroads mourned deeply. But they also celebrated, because the community they had founded continued to thrive. Their children and grandchildren carried on their legacy, and new families continued to arrive, seeking the acceptance and peace that Crossroads offered. The cabin where it all began was preserved as a community gathering place, and a new tradition developed. Every winter, when the first heavy snow fell, the people of Crossroads would gather at the cabin to tell the story of how their community began. They would speak of the mysterious cleared path, of the brave orc woman who had shown kindness to a stranger, and of the human man who had responded with acceptance instead of fear. And then, they would all go out together to clear the paths of Crossroads, working side by side regardless of their species or heritage, honoring the simple act of service that had started everything. The children would laugh and play in the snow while their parents worked, and no one ever felt alone or isolated because they knew they were part of something larger than themselves. The story of Idris and Grusha lived on, a reminder that the most profound changes often begin with the smallest acts of kindness, and that love, when given the chance, can overcome even the deepest divides. Their legacy was not just the community they built, but the hope they represented: hope that understanding could replace fear, that acceptance could replace prejudice, and that different peoples could come together to build something beautiful and lasting. And it all began on a cold winter morning, with a mysterious cleared path and the courage of two people to reach across the divide and take a chance on each other. From that simple beginning came a love story that transformed not just two lives, but an entire community, proving once and for all that the choice to see the person behind the labels was always worth making.